Zala, a resilient yet exhausted traveler, trudged through the thick wilderness, her body aching with hunger and thirst. The scorching sun bore down on her as she stumbled over gnarled roots and uneven terrain. She had been traveling for days, surviving only on dew collected from leaves and the occasional wild fruit she dared to eat. She had not meant to be in this situation. Days ago she had been part of a caravan, merchants, nomads and travelers all moving together for safety. But that safety had been shattered when they were ambushed by ruthless bandits in the dead of night. Chaos erupted as people ran in all directions, desperate to escape. Zala had been among them, sprinting into the unknown, her only thought being survival. When the dust had settled, she found herself utterly alone in the vast and uncharted jungle. With no sense of direction, no supplies and no clear way back, she wandered, hoping for a miracle. On the fourth day, just as the weight of exhaustion and despair threatened to consume her, she saw it. Through the dense foliage, partially hidden by towering trees, lay a village, one that looked untouched by time. The sight filled her with cautious hope. Smoke curled gently from small clay huts, the smell of food drifted through the air, and figures moved about, engaged in their daily tasks. But something about it was odd. The village seemed too perfect, as if it had been carefully preserved rather than naturally weathered by time. The huts were pristine, the paths clear of debris, and the air carried an unsettling silence despite the visible presence of people. Still, she had no other choice. Help was help, no matter how strange the circumstances. As Zala stepped forward, the villagers noticed her. One by one they turned their heads, watching in eerie silence. No whispers, no gasps, just silent, observant stares. A shiver ran down her spine. She had expected surprise, maybe even hostility, but not this quiet acceptance. Then, without a word, the villagers parted, forming a clear path toward the village center. It was as if they had been expecting her. Before she could second-guess herself, a woman stepped forward, holding a clay cup of water. Zala hesitated, then took it, drinking eagerly. The villagers nodded approvingly. "Thank you," she murmured, voice hoarse from thirst. An elderly man, clad in robes embroidered with unfamiliar symbols, emerged from a large hut. His deep-set eyes studied her, and after a long moment he spoke. "You were meant to come to us." Zala froze. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest. Meant to? Her exhaustion begged her to dismiss the unease growing inside her. She was simply reading too much into things, wasn't she? After all, she had finally found safety. Or so she thought. Zala sat on the wooden mat inside a small hut, a steaming bowl of stew placed before her. The aroma of rich spices filled the air, and she eagerly took a bite. The warmth spread through her, easing the ache of days spent wandering through the wilderness. For the first time in days she felt safe. The villagers had given her food, fresh water, and even provided a place to rest. The hut she was assigned was small but immaculate, not a speck of dust, no cracks in the walls, no signs of wear despite looking ancient. It was as if time never touched this place. As the day passed, Zala took in her surroundings. The village was unlike anything she had ever seen. The huts looked untouched by time, their walls smooth and unweathered. The pathways were clear, the fields flourishing with crops, yet no one seemed to tend to them. The villagers moved gracefully, almost too perfectly, their steps synchronized, their gestures calm and controlled. They treated her with kindness, always offering assistance before she even asked. Too kind. Too aware. It was subtle, but Zala caught glances exchanged between them, quick, knowing looks like they were keeping a secret. Whenever she tried to ask questions, they only smiled and changed the subject. That strange feeling from earlier returned, creeping into her thoughts. Something about this place wasn't right. That night, sleep came easily, but it didn't last long. A faint sound stirred her awake, chanting. At first she thought it was the wind, but the sound grew rhythmic, deliberate. It came from deeper within the village. The voices were low, humming in a language she didn't recognize. She peered outside, expecting to see a gathering, but the pathways were empty. The fire pits had burned low, casting eerie shadows across the perfect huts. The chanting continued. Zala's heart pounded, but she forced herself to dismiss it. It's just a village ritual. Nothing more. She turned back inside, convincing herself there was no reason to be afraid. Just as she lay back down, a voice whispered from the shadows. Not all kindness is free. Zala's breath caught. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkness. From the corner of the hut, an elderly woman stood partially hidden in the shadows. Her eyes were sharp, unlike the placid gazes of the other villagers. Her voice was low, urgent. Zala swallowed hard. What do you mean? The woman only shook her head and whispered again. Not all kindness is free. Then, as silently as she had appeared, the woman slipped back into the night, vanishing like a ghost. Zala sat frozen, the unease growing like a storm inside her. Something was very, very wrong with this place. Morning sunlight streamed through the hut's small window, casting a golden glow on the earthen walls. Zala stretched, her muscles still sore from days of wandering. Was time to leave. The eerie warning from the old woman lingered in her mind, but she brushed it aside. The villagers had been nothing but kind. Still, she couldn't shake the growing unease. She stepped outside, inhaling the crisp jungle air. Everything seemed the same, too same. The village was as pristine as when she arrived, the huts unchanged, the paths untouched. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the cloth around her shoulders and headed toward the path she had come from. Her steps slowed as confusion took hold. The path was gone. The narrow trail she had followed just the day before had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of dense jungle. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show anyone had ever walked through. Panic tightened in her chest. She turned to a nearby villager, a man with a peaceful expression, tending to an unblemished row of crops. Excuse me, but where is the path I came from? The man barely glanced at her before replying, the jungle shifts. The path will return when it is time. Zala's heart pounded. And when will that be? The man smiled gently. Perhaps tomorrow. She felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her. The same knowing glances. The same eerie silence. The village chief appeared then, dressed in elaborate robes, his presence commanding yet calm. Zala, child, you must not leave yet. His voice was deep, almost soothing. You are tired? Stay one more night. The jungle will not welcome you today. Something about the way he spoke made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a command. Zala hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but where would she go? The jungle was dense, unfamiliar. If the path was gone, she could wander for days, lost again. Reluctantly she nodded. One more night. Then she would leave. As she wandered through the village later that afternoon, a small hand suddenly gripped hers. She turned in surprise and saw a young girl, no older than 10, with deep brown eyes filled with fear. Take me with you. Zala froze. What? The girl looked around nervously before tugging Zala toward a secluded spot between two huts. You have to take me with you, she whispered. Before it's too late. Zala knelt, gripping the child's shoulders. What do you mean? The girl Imani bit her lip, her gaze darting around. You don't understand. People who come here, they don't leave. At least, not as themselves. A chill ran down Zala's spine. What are you saying? Imani's voice trembled. The villagers, they weren't always here. They were like you once. Travelers. Lost souls. They stayed too long. Zala's breath hitched. Was this some kind of twisted trap? Were the villagers prisoners too? Imani clutched her arm tighter. If you don't leave before the next moon, you'll become one of them. Zala pulled away slightly, her pulse racing. That's not possible, she whispered. That can't be true. But deep inside she already knew. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the village transformed. The air grew thick with the scent of burning incense, and the distant sound of drums echoed through the trees. The villagers moved in eerie harmony, their faces serene, their eyes filled with something unreadable. Zala sat inside the hut they had given her, heart pounding. Imani's warning replayed in her mind, if you don't leave before the next moon you'll become one of them. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A group of women entered, their hands carrying fabrics of deep crimson and gold. Without a word they began dressing her, their movements smooth, practiced. The fabric felt too fine, too ceremonial, as they draped it over her shoulders and wrapped golden beads around her wrists. What is this for? She asked, her voice tight. One of the women, an elder with piercing eyes, smiled in a way that made Zala's stomach twist. Tonight is special, she said. Tonight you fulfill your purpose. Zala's breath came in shallow gasps as they led her toward the village square. Torches flickered around the open space, casting long, shifting shadows. A massive stone altar stood at the center, carved with ancient symbols that seemed to pulse in the firelight. The entire village had gathered, men, women, and even children, standing in perfect rows, their expressions eerily calm. A slow, rhythmic chant rose into the air. Zala's skin prickled as the energy around her changed. The space between her and the villagers felt thin, electric, as if something unseen was pressing against her. The chief stepped forward, his ceremonial robes flowing behind him. He raised his hands and the chanting grew louder, the villagers swaying in unison. Tonight, his voice boomed, we honor the great spirit that watches over us. And tonight, it shall receive its vessel. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Zala felt her stomach drop. A vessel. She took a step back, but invisible hands gripped her. She couldn't move. Her muscles locked in place as if unseen chains had wrapped around her body. Her breath hitched, panic rising as the villagers closed in. The chief's eyes glowed a deep, unnatural gold. You were chosen, Zala. It was always meant to be. Her pulse pounded against her skull as the villagers formed a tight circle around her. The chanting intensified, their voices merging into one overwhelming hum that vibrated through her bones. Zala struggled, but her limbs refused to obey. A crushing force pressed against her chest, as though something was trying to crawl inside her. Images flashed through her mind, faces distorted in agony, past travelers dressed in ceremonial robes just like hers, their eyes hollow, their souls drained. Her body swayed, weakening under the power of the ritual. No. She wouldn't let this happen. With every ounce of willpower she had left, she forced out a strangled whisper, no. The villagers didn't stop. The chief's eyes burned brighter, his voice thunderous. Do not resist. The spirit has chosen you. Surrender and you shall know peace. Zala gritted her teeth. No. A sharp pain stabbed into her chest, like claws gripping her very soul. Her vision blurred. The altar seemed to glow, and the world around her began to fade. She was slipping. Her body was giving in. And then, a voice. Faint, distant. A whisper. Fight. Imani? A sudden rush of clarity surged through her. Zala clenched her fists. She wasn't ready to surrender. The ritual was trying to take her, but she wasn't gone yet. Summoning her last strength, she let out a scream, and the fire around them flickered violently. Darkness swallowed Zala whole. Her body felt weightless, drifting between the world she knew and something far worse. A strange energy pulsed through her veins, cold, ancient, hungry. She tried to move, to scream, but her voice was lost in the suffocating silence. Then, suddenly, visions. She saw a man standing in the same ceremonial robe she wore, his eyes wide with terror. Villagers surrounded him, their chants vibrating through the air. His body convulsed, his screams turning into agonized wails. Something invisible crawled into him, twisting his form, warping his face. Then silence. His body straightened. His expression emptied. He was no longer himself. Another vision. A woman, her hands clawing at her own skin as the villagers held her down. Her body flickered between forms, her own and something monstrous. When the transformation was complete, she turned, eyes glowing with unnatural light. She opened her mouth to scream, but only laughter came out. Zala's stomach twisted. This was their fate. This was what she would become. Her surroundings shifted. She was no longer watching from the outside, she was inside the vision. She stood in a long, endless corridor lined with shadowy figures. Their faces were blank, their bodies barely more than echoes. And yet, she could hear them whispering. We were once like you. The figures stepped forward. Their features flickered, shifting from one identity to another. Men, women, even children. Travelers. Wanderers. Victims. We are the forgotten. The ones who stayed. The ones who lost. Zala backed away, heart hammering. No. I won't. A sharp pull yanked her forward. She gasped as pain shot through her chest. It felt like her soul was being torn apart, stretched thin, about to snap. The spirit was claiming her. A soft sob broke through the vision. Zala turned, and her heart shattered. Imani. The little girl stood a few feet away, tears streaming down her face. But something was wrong. Her eyes, they weren't just sad. They were empty. You have to run, Imani whispered. Before it's too late. Zala reached for her, but her fingers passed through Imani's small frame like smoke. She wasn't real. Not anymore. You, Zala's throat tightened. She finally understood. Imani had been a traveler once, just like her. And now, she was nothing more than a fragment of the spirit's curse, doomed to warn others who could never escape. Zala shook her head, panic setting in. No. No, I won't let this happen. The air trembled. A deep, guttural voice echoed all around her. You are already mine. Pain ripped through her as her body began to change. Her limbs felt foreign, her thoughts fragmented. The spirit's power was twisting its way inside her, devouring what remained of her identity. Her mind screamed. She had to fight. But how? Zala's body trembled as the spirit's power tried to consume her. Darkness slithered through her veins, tightening its grip around her soul. Her vision blurred, flickering between the real world and the cursed realm of those who had been trapped before her. Just when she thought she would lose herself completely, a soft whisper broke through the haze. "Zala, listen." The voice was ancient, layered, filled with both sorrow and strength. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, echoing from beyond. "Do not surrender. The spirit can be severed, but you must act now." Zala gasped, her mind clawing its way back from the abyss. Who are you?" she whispered. "We were once like you. We fought but we failed. You must not fail." A sudden wave of clarity surged through her mind. These were the voices of the lost souls, the ones who had been taken before her. But unlike the others, they hadn't succumbed completely. They had resisted. "There is one way to break the curse," they whispered. "The temple. The idol. Destroy it and the spirit's hold will shatter." Zala's heartbeat quickened. The temple. A vision flashed before her eyes, a grand stone structure hidden deep within the village. At its center stood an idol, pulsating with dark energy, its form twisting as if alive. "No one has ever reached it," the voices warned. "But you must." Zala clenched her fists. She would. Summoning the last of her strength, she tore herself free from the spirit's grip. A powerful shockwave pulsed through her, sending her collapsing to the ground. The villagers gasped. Their chanting faltered. Zala pushed herself up, her breath ragged. The chief's eyes burned with fury. "She resists. Stop her," he roared. The villagers lunged forward, their faces twisting with unnatural rage. Zala ran. Her legs burned as she bolted through the village, weaving between huts, dodging grasping hands. The jungle trembled around her, the very air thick with dark magic. Behind her, footsteps pounded the earth. The villagers were no longer human. Their eyes glowed with an eerie golden light, their movements unnatural, bodies jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. They were puppets. The spirit's servants. And they would never let her leave. The temple emerged ahead, its towering stone walls covered in vines. Zala slammed into the doors, shoving them open with all her strength. She stumbled inside. The air was thick with energy, pulsing with every heartbeat. The walls bore carvings of past sacrifices, depicting centuries of suffering. At the temple's center, standing on an ancient pedestal, was the idol. It was grotesque, twisting, writhing, almost breathing. Dark tendrils of energy seeped from it, stretching toward her like hungry fingers. Zala took a shaky step forward. "Destroy it," the ancestors urged. "Now." She lifted a trembling hand. The doors burst open behind her. The villagers swarmed in, their movements frantic, desperate. "Stop her," the chief bellowed. Zala lunged. She grabbed a heavy stone from the temple floor and lifted it above her head. The idol let out a piercing shriek as if it knew what was coming. Zala brought the stone down with all her strength. Crack. A tremor shook the temple. The idol split down the middle, dark energy gushing out like blood. The villagers screamed. Their bodies convulsed, their glowing eyes flickering. One by one they collapsed, their forms withering away into dust. The temple walls shook violently as the spirit howled in fury, its presence unraveling. Zala staggered back, gasping. The whispers of the ancestors faded into silence. She had done it. She had broken the curse. But as the temple began to collapse around her, a chilling thought crept into her mind. Had she truly escaped? Zala pushed through the crumbling entrance of the forbidden temple, her breath ragged, her body trembling from exhaustion. The moment she crossed the threshold, a wave of icy energy rushed over her, sending a chill deep into her bones. The temple was ancient, untouched by time. Carvings lined the walls, depicting past sacrifices, figures kneeling before a towering spirit, their faces twisted in agony. The floor was layered with dust, but beneath it she could see faded symbols etched into the stone, pulsing faintly. A whisper drifted through the air. "You should not have come." Zala froze. The voice was neither human nor entirely of this world. The moment she stepped forward, the doors behind her slammed shut, sealing her inside. She was trapped. At the heart of the temple, standing atop a raised altar, was the idol. It was grotesque, its form shifting, its surface covered in writhing faces, their mouths open in silent screams. The object pulsed with a sickly golden light, dark tendrils of energy seeping from its base like spreading roots. The whispers grew louder. "The vessel must not defy us." Zala's pulse pounded in her ears. The spirit was here. A gust of wind tore through the chamber, though there were no windows. The shadows around her twisted, stretching unnaturally. And then, it appeared. A monstrous shape rose from the idol, its form shifting like smoke, yet solidifying into something that resembled a creature of pure malice. It was towering, skeletal, its eyes hollow yet burning with golden light. Its elongated fingers dripped with darkness, its mouth stretching far too wide. The spirit had taken form. "You dare defy the cycle?" Its voice boomed, rattling the temple walls. Zala stumbled back as a wave of pressure forced her to her knees. Her head throbbed, her vision flickering. "Do not surrender," the voices of the ancestors urged. "Remember the incantation." Through the pain, she forced herself to recall the words they had whispered to her in the jungle. Her lips parted and she began to chant. The spirit screeched in fury. The moment the words left her mouth, the carvings on the walls began to glow, their symbols burning like embers. The temple trembled. Zala forced herself to her feet, her body heavy with the weight of the spirit's wrath. The monster lunged, its clawed hands reaching for her. Zala dodged, barely escaping its grasp. She grabbed a fallen torch, its flame flickering wildly as she turned toward the idol. "Destroy it," the ancestors cried. She gritted her teeth. This was her only chance. The spirit roared, the sound shaking the ground beneath her. Dark tendrils shot out from the idol, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her toward it. Zala screamed, twisting against its grip. The idol's glow intensified, its surface shifting, revealing even more tortured faces trapped within it. She could see them now, the souls of those who had failed before her. Imani's words rang in her head, "All outsiders who enter never leave the same." She refused to become one of them. With every ounce of strength she had left, she raised the torch and hurled it directly at the idol. The moment the fire touched it, the idol let out an unearthly shriek. A blinding light erupted from within, and the dark tendrils recoiled violently. Zala stumbled back, shielding her eyes as cracks began to spread across the idol's surface. The spirit let out a monstrous howl, thrashing wildly as its source of power crumbled. Zala didn't hesitate. She grabbed a fallen ceremonial spear from the ground and, with a desperate cry, drove it into the idol's heart. Crack! The idol shattered. A wave of golden energy exploded outward, ripping through the temple, tearing through the village. The ground quaked violently. Zala collapsed, her body shaking as she watched the spirit disintegrate before her, its form twisting, shrieking as it was pulled into the abyss. The villagers, those who had been bound to its will, let out one final agonized scream. Then all at once they fell silent. The temple walls began to crumble. Zala gasped, pushing herself up. She had to get out. No. She turned and ran toward the collapsing doors, leaping over the breaking stone. Behind her, the entire village was unraveling, vanishing into the void. The spirits were gone. The cycle had ended. Or so she thought. A deafening silence followed the destruction of the idol. For a moment, everything stood still. No whispers, no chants, no monstrous presence looming over her. Then one by one the villagers collapsed where they stood. Their bodies crumbled into dust, dissolving into the wind like dried leaves. Their expressions were not of pain but of peace, as if after centuries of torment, they had finally found rest. Zala staggered backward, watching in horror as the village itself began to unravel. The wooden huts cracked and splintered, their structures collapsing into nothingness. The once pristine ground split open, revealing an abyss beneath. A piercing, otherworldly scream filled the air, one final cry of rage from the vanishing spirit. The monstrous force that had held the village in its grip for generations was no more. But then, from the swirling remnants of the ritual, a small figure remained standing. Zala's eyes widened. "Imani." Zala rushed forward, reaching out for the girl, but something was wrong. Imani stood motionless, her small hands trembling, her body bathed in the golden light of the fading curse. Then, before Zala's eyes, the girl began to change. Her skin wrinkled, her posture hunched, and her innocent face aged rapidly, transforming into that of an old woman. Zala gasped, stepping back in shock. Imani had been trapped in the village for centuries. The curse had preserved her, holding her in a timeless state. Now that it was broken, her body was catching up to its true age. Tears welled in Imani's now clouded eyes. "I told you," she whispered, her voice frail. "No one leaves the same." Her body shuddered and she smiled, one last time, before collapsing into dust just like the others. A gust of wind carried her remains away, scattering them into the crumbling ruins of the village. Zala stood frozen, her hands trembling, unable to process what she had just witnessed. She had saved Imani from the spirit's control. But she had not saved her from time. The ground beneath Zala cracked violently, snapping her out of her daze. The village was disappearing. The jungle beyond it seemed to fold in on itself, the ancient structures dissolving into nothing but shadows and dust. She had to get out. Now. Zala turned and ran as fast as her body would allow, dodging falling debris, leaping over gaping holes in the earth. The sky darkened as if the world itself was unraveling. She sprinted through the collapsing ruins, her breath ragged, her legs screaming in pain. The exit was just ahead, a break in the trees where the jungle began. With one final burst of energy, she lunged forward, escaping just as the last remnants of the village crumbled into the void. Then, silence. The air was still. The jungle around her was untouched, as if the village had never existed. Zala collapsed to her knees, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to catch her breath. It was over. She was free. Or was she? As she sat there, trying to calm her racing heart, a strange feeling crept over her. Something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. She looked down at her hands. Her breath caught in her throat. Faint golden markings had begun to appear on her skin. Symbols, ancient and pulsing, just like the ones she had seen in the temple. She scrubbed at them, trying to rub them away, but they did not fade. A shiver crawled down her spine. The whispers were gone. The villagers were gone. But the curse? It was still with her. That night, as she rested against a tree, exhaustion finally overtaking her, she felt it. A presence. A voice, soft and familiar, whispering from the darkness of the jungle. Come back, Zala. Her blood ran cold. She slowly turned to the small puddle of water beside her, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. And as she gazed at her reflection, her own face smirked back at her. Zala stumbled into the nearest town after days of wandering through the jungle, her body weak, her mind clouded with exhaustion. The world outside felt distant, unfamiliar, too bright, too loud, too alive. People passed by, oblivious to the horror she had endured. She told herself she was safe now, that it was over. Yet, deep in her bones, she knew that wasn't true. The village may have vanished. The spirit may have been destroyed. But something had followed her back. Days turned to weeks, and Zala tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. She settled in a quiet town near the jungle, far from where the village had once stood. She spoke to no one of what had happened. She barely spoke at all. But the signs were there. Everywhere. One morning, as she washed her hands, she noticed the marks. Faint golden symbols, etched into her skin, glowing softly, pulsing like a living thing. At first, she thought they were scratches, remnants of her struggle to escape. But they didn't fade. Day after day they grew clearer, spreading like veins of fire beneath her flesh. She tried covering them, scratching them, burning them. Nothing worked. And then came the whispers. At night, the jungle called to her. It started as a faint hum in the wind, a distant murmur just beyond her window. Then the voices came. They slithered through the darkness, soft and familiar. Come back, Zala. You were chosen. You are not free. She shut her ears, buried herself under blankets, tried to convince herself it was all in her head. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, inside her. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred until she could no longer tell which was which. Her own shadow moved when she stood still. Her reflection lingered too long in mirrors, watching her even after she turned away. And then, one night, it smiled. Zala froze. She had been washing her face, staring at herself in the mirror when it happened. For a split second she thought she had imagined it. Then, slowly, her reflection smirked. Not a normal smirk. Something wrong. Twisted. Inhuman. Her breath hitched. She stepped back. But the reflection didn't move. It just stood there grinning. You thought you escaped? Zala's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to run. To scream. To wake up from this nightmare. But she couldn't look away. The golden markings on her arms glowed brighter, and her reflection lifted its hand, moving before she did. Her own voice, yet not her own, whispered from the mirror. You are mine now. The candlelight flickered. The whispers in her head swelled into laughter. Zala clenched her fists, her breath ragged. She had escaped the village. But she had not escaped the spirit. And now it lived inside her. You said. ChatGPT said. Do you want me to continue with another chapter, refine this one, or start a new story?